We've talked about buttons, and we've talked about pop-up button menus. So now we're going to talk about sliders. So let me look for the slider in the object library. So a slider displays a range of values for something in the application. So this lets the user pick a value from a range of available values in the slider. So let me drag a slider out to the view controller. And I'm going to make it wider. In the attribute inspector portion of Xcode, you can set the number of tick marks for the slider. You can specify where you want the tick marks to be, either above or below. You can set that the slider will only stop on tick marks, and you can specify the values, a minimum value, maximum value, and where you want the current slider to be in terms of the range of values by default. The look of the slider actually changes depending on whether you want tick marks or not. So let's say my number of tick marks is 0, so I'm going to change this to 4, and you see the shape turn from a circle to a pentagon for the current value. So if I change it back to 0 and hit enter, it's back to a circle right here. So in case you didn't see it, I'll just do it again with the magnifier on so you can see the pentagon. And now it's a circle for the current value. Now we'll create an outlet for the slider. So again, it's a control drag and drop. And I'm going to call this my horizontal slider. Click connect. And I'm going to use code to change some of the properties for this slider. I'm going to put this code under view did load. I'm going to set the allow tick mark values only to equals true. So it's going to allow tick marks, and the maximum value will be 10. And by convention, we use a float value for setting values on the slider, and the minimum value will be 0. No, let's make it 1. We're going to set the number of tick marks to be 10. And the current value as a float value when the view loads, by default we're going to use 1 by default. And now we're going to code it so that when user clicks the button, it will display the value of the slider. So we're going to add the slider value to the end of the label, or my label. We add a space in between the value from the pop-up button and the value from the slider. And we're going to convert the float value to a string. And it's going to be 1 decimal place. So that way we don't get a long, a value with a long number of decimal places. So we're going to get the float value of the slider's current position. And now we'll run it and see what happens. And you can see that the slider begins at 1 by default. So now I'm going to drag the slider and change it to somewhere here. I believe this is 7. And I'm going to click the button. It's going to tell me the slider is 7. And if I change my pop-up button selection and I change my slider and I hit the button, it'll update. And it's also incrementing the text box or text field value by 1. So all of it is working as it should. Now we're going to add a vertical slider to our view controller. And we're going to make it longer length. And I'm also going to add a label to show the value of the vertical slider. And just going to stretch it out to make it longer. Well, we're not going to add tick marks to the vertical slider. And so now I'm going to create outlets for the vertical slider and the label. So there's the outlet for the vertical slider. Make myself a little more space. Outlet for the label. And now we have outlets for both. So in our view did load, we're going to add some code to this vertical slider. Actually, we're going to add code to the label for the vertical slider. Pardon me. And this is similar to what I did for the horizontal slider. It's going to be formatted to display values of 1 decimal place. So by default, the label will display whatever the value of the slider's current value is. Another thing I need is an action for when the user changes the slider. Drag and drop an action. I'm going to change the connection to action, and the type is in a slider. And this is an action for when the vertical slider changed connect. And I'm going to set the label for the vertical slider when the slider changes. I'm going to copy and paste this code over. So now we're going to run it. And I believe the label is not long enough. So let me make the label even longer. And run it again. So here, now it's working as expected. My label is showing the vertical slider value. So if I change it, it'll update the label. So I can go all the way down to 0 or 100, the minimum and the maximum values by default. And values along the way to 1 decimal place.